Good afternoon, viewers. I am Shankar Kumar. I teach history at the Department of History in Hindu College, University of Delhi. And today, the topic that we would be talking about is part of the same series that we have been carrying over for some time now, and that is the Absolutist States and its emergence, the rise of the Absolutist States in Europe. Of course, the time reference is that of the 16th century Europe, and in my earlier interactions with you, I have spoken about some of the general characteristics, features, the historiography around the emergence of absolutist states in Europe, and today we would be carrying that over in terms of our general discussion around the rise of the absolutist states in Europe, and subsequently we would be talking about countries or nationalities proper, like what was the situation in France, what was the situation in England, what was the situation in other parts of Europe. So as of now, this particular interaction is about the general discussion around absolutist states in continuation to what I have already spoken to you in my earlier interactions. So I have just to give you a recap so that you can make a good connect with what we discussed today. You can do well to recall that earlier we have spoken about the historical backdrop in which absolutist states emerged, and that was the dissolution of feudal relations. We all know of the Black Deaths, we all know of the dissolution of feudalism from there on in Europe, and that was like 14th century, 15th century, and then in 16th century we also know of the movement for Reformation, which was like a reform movement within Christendom, within the church. So the Protestantism movement, all those things cumulatively had given some kind of a lever for the existing kings to maximize their control and authority over their subjects through several apparatus of the state, and those apparatus that we have been talking of, like the army, the bureaucracy, taxation system, and so forth, also the legitimacy issue, the theories of divine rule of the king and so forth, all these you can say apparatus got further entrenched in the circumstances created by the dissolution of feudalism and also Protestantism, because please remember that that in Europe the control and command of church till around 15th century was phenomenal, to the extent that the papal authority overshadowed the monarchs, who otherwise were supposed to organize and take care of the mundane affairs of the state. But church had overriding powers over these monarchies as well. So when these monarchies asserted themselves around 16th century, and that is what this story of absolutist states is all about across countries in Europe, in 16th century, we find that they had quite a few adversaries to contend with. For example, on the one side they had the church, and this church control was greatly weakened on account of the reformist movement, and that gave them some kind of a leeway to further the state control in the domains that had just been vacated, or the church had got discredited on those counts, and therefore the secular state is trying to fill that gap by exercising its power, authority through these instruments of control that I just spoke of. And that is what constituted. That is what gave the characteristic attributes of the monarchical state system in Europe henceforth. And that is what this story in a very big canvas is all about. And I have earlier also spoken to you about the historiography of it, about the timing of it. The general accepted notion is that it all began from, say, around 1660 onwards, from the times of Louis XIV, who famously is supposed to have said, "I am the state," and that marks perhaps the beginning of the absolutist control of the state in Europe or in different parts of Europe. But I have earlier also spoken to you that several historians don't agree with this timeline. They say that at least a century back, we already had circumstances and opportunities created even outside France, where the secular authority in the form of monarchs, they are trying to wrest power from agencies that earlier enjoyed it, be it church on one hand, or it could be the feudal lords on the other. So the existing aristocracy, the traditional aristocracy, that is also weakening in terms of the control that they traditionally exercised over the subject population. So the privilege of taxing people, the immunities that they enjoyed with respect to being taxed by the state, and so forth, and the privilege to maintain their own private army and so forth. All these things were being now gradually intruded upon by the monarchs in different parts of Europe in ways that are very different, and therefore some kind of a broad pattern also emerges. And that will happen only when you study country-wise absolutist states, its nature, its social base and so forth, the way they increased or entrenched their authority and so forth. So that is what this discussion has been all about so far, and I'll try to finish this general discussion in this lecture, so that we can come to the country-specific situations, say the classical case in France, or subsequently we can talk about England and the situation there with respect to the emergence of absolutist monarchies. So over and beyond what we have already discussed, we can add to our discussion by talking about the fact that in the phase, as you can see on your slide, in the face of this general appeal or justification for the emergence of absolutist states, and also the obstacles, and I have just pointed to you the obstacles, the aristocracy, the church and so forth. So they constituted the obstacles against which the monarchies had to emerge as the authoritative power, and there was also a sense of justification and some kind of a popular appeal for the emergence of absolutist monarchies. And we will talk about it, that there are some political philosophers like Bodin and so forth who have been talking about it, who have been talking about the necessity, desirability of having absolutist monarchies in their countries, and that would perhaps serve the purpose better. So there are some ideological justifications. There are theories of kingship, divine theories of kingship coming up, and all these things were latched on to by these upcoming monarchies to further strengthen and entrench their power over their subject population. So different monarchies in Europe actually resorted to different attempts to circumvent the powers of the aristocracy and the church. I have just alluded to the Reformation movement in 16th century, and it had different impact in different parts of Europe. We all know about it. For example, in England, it gave rise to Anglican Church, which was a nationalized church, whereas most of the southern or Mediterranean facing countries, including France, Spain and so forth, continued to remain Catholic and non-Protestant. And despite that, you will find that the trend or the pattern of absolutist monarchies emerge. So it's not adequately explained by conversion of people to Protestantism or continuing to remain a Catholic country. Be it Catholic, be it Protestant, this trend towards strengthening of the secular power of the state or making it all the more absolutist is something that continued unabated despite the country being Catholic or Protestant, and we will discover that. As you can see in the second point on your slide, even in Catholic France, Spain or Austria, successive monarchs till around 18th century continued to make efforts, continued to make attempts to nationalize the church and its clergy. So the papal control that was exercised from outside their nation, that was something that was frowned upon, and despite not converting to Protestantism, they did make attempts to nationalize the church and the affairs of Christendom and so forth within their empire, and that called for fair degree of encroachment into powers and domains that earlier were maintained by church or church's decrees and so forth. So they had to take on the clergy, they had to take on the aristocracy as well. For example, as you can see on your slide, Louis XIV, who is regarded as the iconic figure in order to tell you as to what absolutist monarchies was all about. He is credited to have said, "I am the state," and that typifies the power of the monarch. That it is him, it is the monarch who decides as to what is happening, and that is what state was all about. It was the personal whims and fancies of the monarch that became important from around 17th century or so. But as I have discussed earlier, that this was not so. Absolutist monarchies had to operate within several constraints. Some were historically structured in the form of state society, where the nobility, the clergy was immune from being taxed. Similarly, the power of the church, which was all pervasive till Reformation happened. So, and the specific ways and means by which the lower aristocracy or the gentry is trying to assert on account of commercialization, on account of price revolution and so forth. So all these things accorded a kind of distinct dynamics to different areas of Europe, and it is only by taking cognizance of the distinction of an area that one should be looking at this broad umbrella term of absolutist states and the rise of the absolutists, and that is precisely what we are going to do. So Louis XIV in France, for example, deprived the traditional aristocrats of political power while enhancing their social prestige. So what is it that I am trying to say here? What I mean here is that now you have a monarch in France who wants to increase the power of the state, but there are some structural limitations of it, because historically it is the aristocrats in their feudal domains. They are the ones who are who are carrying out the judicial or even administrative or even taxation powers. They are the ones who are exercising it to a great extent, and only the residual collection of it actually goes to the king, to the monarch. But now it's a different picture. So the monarch has to pierce through these structural limitations of traditional aristocracy, and what they do in the bargain is that taxation powers are actually taken away by the monarch from the feudal lords, from the aristocrats, and they just to ensure that it does not lead to some kind of a tumultuous revolt by the aristocracy. So they allow their social prestige to sustain, to survive, or at times even they give some props, they give some ways and means by which they feel that their social prestige is getting enhanced. So the paraphernalia around the aristocrats is not touched upon, whereas the economic or taxation power is something that the monarch takes away from them. Similarly, in other parts of Europe, you will find even military power being taken away from the feudal lords and so forth. So some kind of give and take happens here, and you do well to remember that the countries where some other alternate social group has already matured and they are organized enough to support this new monarchy, absolutist monarchy, in those areas it becomes somewhat easy for the monarch to shift the social base of their rule from the traditional aristocracy to the new aristocracy, or the new landed aristocracy, or even the bourgeoisie, or even the traders, even the merchants, even the urban manufacturers, because they are now emerging as the new tax blocks. So the monarch can get money from there. And this is all happening only from around 16th century in Europe. It was not happening before. In the feudal times, you don't have very many cities and trade opportunities and long distance trade relations or transactions happening. It's happening only from now on, and therefore this opportunity is available to the monarchs only from 16th century and not before. Similarly, as we spoke of Louis XIV, similarly you can see on your slide Peter the Great in Russia in the early 18th century adopts a different technique of dealing with the nobility and thereby leveraging his political power, and that is by co-opting the nobility into government services. Now, again, what is it that I am talking of? I am talking of a situation where the absolutist state now has bigger paraphernalia of bureaucracy, taxation structure and so forth. That calls for more manpower. That has to be supplied from somewhere. And instead of making it open to the people at large, Peter the Great is actually co-opting some of the nobility into government services, and thereby taking care of their immediate economic interest or their prestige and so forth. But over a long period of time, you will find that their local social base is lost, and it is the monarchy that comes to pierce through, that comes to break the existing traditional power that the aristocracy enjoyed. So, although as you discover that all these things, to the extent it happened as a result of, or it happened in the form of some kind of a bargain with the existing aristocrats and nobility, there is no structural shift of economy from feudalism to capitalism. So there is further entrenchment of feudal relations over the peasantry, and therefore in the Eastern Europe you find more entrenchment of feudal relations to the extent that it acquired the form of serfdom, whereas in Western Europe it did provide opportunities for the bourgeoisie to come up in a big way and pave the way further. And by around say last quarter of the 18th century or 19th century, you have the emergence of modern nation states, which Marxists would designate as bourgeois states. So all these things also can be understood as some kind of a preface to nation state formation in Europe. Similarly, Catherine II in Russia resorted to bargain with aristocracy by grant of states, exemption from taxation, and increasing other social and economic privileges. And what is she getting in return for the state? She gets to run the administrative and political powers into the domains that earlier were populated by or were managed by the feudal lords. So, in return of the administrative and political powers, exercise of administrative and political powers, Catherine II gives them a tax exemption and increases other social and economic privileges. So, there is no structural restructuring of economy at the local or agrarian level, but so far as exercise of the monarchical power is concerned, there is a shift. So the monarch, of course, or the monarchy, state monarchy, becomes more important vis-a-vis the feudal lords or the church. Similarly, Frederick the Great in Prussia resorted to co-option of aristocracy by getting the army staffed by its nobles. Again, what I discussed earlier, either it is the administrative staff or it is the armed forces of this new upcoming absolutist monarchies that gets manned by these aristocrats. So, these aristocrats who were having their source of income from elsewhere on account of their local clout and on account of their men and so forth, their feudal rents, is since you have dislodged them from there, so you are giving them some other alternative by which they can sustain themselves or they can continue to feel important, and that is by co-opting them into the expanding army of this new absolutist state, and that is what Frederick the Great is doing in Prussia. Similarly, Joseph II in Austria in the late 18th century had a policy of confrontation with the nobility. So, here it's not a bargain, it's a direct kind of confrontation that happens, and the nobility is denied of any exemption from taxation, and they were deliberately sought to be equated with the commoners. So, there is some kind of a direct confrontation in Austria in the late 18th century happening, and it was not very nuanced and give and take kind of a equation working out here. It was a direct kind of a confrontationist position that the monarch had taken with respect to expanding his power vis-a-vis the existing nobility. So, why I am telling you all about this is just to acquaint you with the range of responses generated or different ways and means by which monarchies strengthened itself across nationalities in Europe. This monarch versus nobility had implication on the centralized power versus local privileges too across Europe. And so, what kind of polities will emerge during the absolutist phase in Europe also depended on what was the result, what was the consequence of this monarch versus nobility in different parts of Europe. So, for example, absolutist France was against the autonomy of provincial institutions. Spanish monarchs were against independent-minded nobles in Aragon and Catalonia. Prussian rulers were against formerly free cities. So, there are attempts to do away with provincial autonomies and deliberately create a more centralized kind of a setup, and that federated kind of polities which was so characteristic of the feudal times, that is something that is getting diluted or intruded upon. So, and I have referred to you earlier also about the political philosophers like Baudin or Bishop Jacques Bossuet. For example, Bossuet wrote the work Politics, drawn from the very words of scriptures, and that meant that he was almost providing some kind of a divine basis of the rule for these upcoming monarchs, and this was written during Louis XIV's period. So this emphasized the ideas that that king being answerable only to God, or king as being above other mortals like God was above king. So in people at large, this is the projection of the image of the king that gets reinforced through these theories, through these writings of the political philosophers. So that tells you about the kind of popular appeal or intellectual buttressing of the change that is happening. So these divine right theories were greatly leveraged by James I in England, for example. So overall, just to sum up, to strengthen the rule, the absolutist monarchs adopted several ways, and that we have all discussed. I am just trying to cap it. We talked about bureaucratization. So absolutist monarchies meant more and more of bureaucratic apparatus getting installed over the administration, and it is through this new bureaucracy that the monarch is exercising power, and not through the traditional nobility and so forth. Similarly, creation of legitimacy, I just spoke to you about the divine theory of kingship. Homogenization of subject population, so this is about uniformity. Regional changes were sought to be diluted and deliberately sought to be homogenized, just to give a semblance of uniformity and tightness under one monarch. Similarly, there are attempts to have a national system of taxation, some kind of a unified taxation system, uniform taxation system, and that is what next point is all about: unified domestic market and merchant capitalism, and also codification of law. So regional, local laws that were prevalent under different feudal lords, they were sought to be done away with through judicial reforms and so forth, alongside the emergence of the absolutist monarchies. So that is the big picture of the rise of absolutist monarchies in Europe from around 16th century and even prior to it. And whenever I meet you next, I shall be talking about the experience of one particular nation with respect to absolutist monarchies. Thank you.